Welcome to the RStudio Enterprise Community Meetup. I think it was a little delayed here, so let me start over again. Hi, friends. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the RStudio Enterprise Community Meetup. I'm Rachel, calling in from a rainy Boston today. If you just joined now, feel free to say hi through the chat window and maybe where you're calling in from. If this is your first time joining one of these sessions, we do have them every Tuesday at noon Eastern Time. And so I'll share a calendar of all the upcoming events in the chat in just a second here, where you can add whole calendar or individual events to your own calendar too. This is a friendly and open meetup environment for teams to share different use cases with each other and teach lessons learned. Together, we're all dedicated to making this an inclusive and open environment for everyone, no matter your experience, your industry, or background. During the event, you can also ask questions on the platform that you are watching from. You're also able to ask anonymous questions as well through rstd.io/meetupquestions, which I'll put on the screen here in just a second too. But with all of that, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I would love to pull Ryan up here on stage. And let me handle my little side panel here. Hi, Ryan. Thanks so much for joining us. Ryan leads Veterans Affairs' quantitative approach to improving employee engagement, primarily through feedback and related outcome data. Thank you, Ryan, for sharing your experience.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you all for the time. So I'll talk about how we use Shiny and RStudio Connect at the Department of Veterans Affairs for our Executive Dashboard project. So as you probably know, VA's mission, which of course I'm here to talk about our work specifically, not VA more broadly. VA's mission is to provide healthcare and benefits and burial services for U.S. veterans. And the mission of my office of NCOD is to improve employee engagement in VA so that those services can be provided most effectively. We do that in the way that's most relevant here through enterprise survey and data science services. So some context for that work is that VA is quite large, as you may know, 400,000 plus employees from Manila to San Juan to Maine, every kind of occupation you can think of, hundreds of hospitals and clinics and benefits offices and cemeteries. So in contrast to that, my office is quite small. Our headcount is about 50. So on one hand, that's really exciting because we can have a very outsized impact and work in a very high leveraged way. But it also means we have to punch way above our weight class to have the kind of impact that we need to have. So some of the tools and processes I can talk about today are what help us do that. So just a little bit of info about the data that go into the application I'll show you, and then we'll, of course, jump into the actual app. The primary data source from surveys that we use is something called the All-Employee Survey. And every year, VA administers the AES to every employee. Very comprehensive. It covers everything from engagement to burnout to psychological safety, patient safety, specific modules for specific occupations. So there's between 70 and 120 questions depending on what you do. And it's our primary data source for organizational health. And it's also one of the most important, maybe in some ways the most important feedback mechanism that VA has for hearing about how we can provide better services to veterans. It gets a great response rate. So we have representative high quality data, about 70% response rate this year. People feel like they can be honest because it's anonymous, and the data go lots of places into executives' performance plans and get reported in important ways. But from NCOD's perspective, the most important purpose of the data is for work group level improvement. So a work group is just a group of 5 or 10 or 15 people who work together on a day-to-day basis. So for that improvement to happen, first of all, of course, work groups need to have their data and be able to discuss it and see what it's telling them and strategize about how to improve their day-to-day work life. But for purposes today at the executive level, of course, executives need to know what's going on. Basically, they need to know where there are hotspots, things to watch out for, any trends that may be concerning or noteworthy. And so the app and the briefing process that we use helps get executives that level of data they need, and in a quick way, and also in a way that's very durable and that they can use as a reference. So we brief every executive team in VA, which is about 300 teams, 2,000, probably closer to 2,500 individuals. So for example, at a hospital, the executive team would be the director, a few service chiefs, and maybe a few other people too. So the top 4, 5, 6, 7 people at every site. And we brief them directly from the dashboard that I'll show you in just a second. So we used to use giant PowerPoints and big Excel files, and those were great as references, but as you can imagine, not terribly compelling when you have the kind of data we have at the scale that we have it. So the dashboard's been a huge improvement for us. Just a few final points about the app itself. Flat CSV files are our data source, so no fancy APIs or databases. And the displays are also pretty simple, as you'll see. We mostly use bar charts, line graphs, and tables. And I note this here because if you're like me, you see some of the really sophisticated and cool apps that other people make that do bring in lots of other data sources and have lots of cool plugins and so on. And it's easy, at least for me, to think that you have to do that kind of stuff for it to be useful. So for what it's worth, we've gotten a lot of mileage out of pretty simple backends. The other thing you'll see that we put a lot of work into is for the interface to look relatively coherent, hopefully, and for it to be predictable. Because with the audience we have, it's just not tenable to expect 2,500 executives to learn some idiosyncratic interface or deal with fiddly UI issues. So it needs to be very predictable, very polished, and also pretty responsive, because these briefings last for 60 minutes, and that's a lot of time, but also it's not. So even if we had a few minutes of cumulative lag waiting for things to update or to calculate, that's a decent percentage of our total time. So those are some considerations that we've had to deal with while building this application. I'll try to pause for questions periodically, but feel free to interrupt with any questions or points of elaboration you'd like me to make. So with that, I will change screens, hopefully.
I was just going to say, I'll pop in here when there are some questions too, but just wanted to remind everyone that you can ask either on LinkedIn if you're watching there or on YouTube Live. Also, there's the Slido link for anonymous questions too.
And so one of the considerations that if you do this at scale, you'll run into is bandwidth. So we have a relatively large backend server, but when you have hundreds of people coming at the same time to it, it's going to sometimes be slow. So hopefully we get a pretty good response now, because actually the briefings are going on right now. So I came from one this morning, I've got one this afternoon. So there's a lot of traffic on this platform right now. So the first thing you see when you go to the link that we give to all executives, and I'll just make it full screen, VA's numbers come up by default. So one of the good things about doing it in this way is that it's really easy to be very transparent with all the data that we have, because anybody in VA can pick data for any group in VA. So there's no kind of compartmentalizing the information. Everything is fully available for anyone to see. The other thing that makes it very easy to do is to go into deep dives on specific groups that may be of interest during a particular briefing. So if we're briefing the one of the undersecretaries, for example, who are over lots of different facilities, and they have a question about a specific facility, we can go right to that facility in this input, and everything else updates with that facility's data. So it's a great way to be responsive in real time versus having to take questions and then come back with additional reports. So I'll go to our demo page, which has fictitious data. So it's representative of what a facility would see, but the numbers are not real. So as I go through this, I'll show you what we have, and I'll try to focus more on the app itself than the data points, which is kind of backwards from how the briefings would go, of course, but I'm happy to talk about any of it, so feel free to break in with questions on the app itself or the data. So the first thing you may notice is that it doesn't look like the standard shiny app that you get by default. It's a Bootstrap page running Bootstrap 5 with the bslib package. So that gives us a good bit of flexibility, because then we can use Bootstrap's native row column layout to get exactly what we want. It's also, so you'll notice the picture, for example, in the top right. So for every facility, we find a story about that facility that's been published by that facility itself, that talks about some service that's been provided or some efforts that have been undertaken that are what the data we have tried to promote. So in the case here, this is the picture from the Chicago VA. And a lot of VAs do this, and it's really cool. They partner with local community service organizations, veterans organizations, and so on. And they'll do things like drive-through baby showers. So if you're a veteran and your family just had a baby and you need some help, you can show up and drive through basically a big tunnel where they load you up with everything that you need in your car. And if you haven't seen the kind of impact that kind of service and work can have, it's really, really effective. So we try to tie in what's actually going on the ground to the data we have, just to build a connection. There's a story that's linked behind the picture, and I'll not click on it now just to save the back and forth, but the actual stories are linked here as well. There's a video that we put behind it's an embedded YouTube video. It's in an iframe, and it just sets the tone for why we do the survey in the first place. It's not really about tracking a bunch of numbers. It's about changing how people experience their day-to-day work at VA. And then throughout, you'll also see a red, yellow, green color heuristic by default to indicate when a score is good or okay or not so great. Of course, some people can't see that, so it's easy to change to an alternate palette or to pick a custom palette that anybody can see. The trick with something like this that I learned the hard way is you want to bring in the color scheme as late in the reactive chain as you can, so that if someone changes the color scheme, you're not refiring all the reactives that would do data manipulations that don't need to be redone. You want to just reskin the graphs, basically. And it's tedious to do that after you do it the other way. So you want to make sure to do that early on. So the first thing we show people are some key numbers that correspond to important things that VA leaders care about. The response rate obviously is important because you need to know how representative your data are. Data sharing and data use refer to the extent that people at that organization say they've seen their data and that it's been used to improve their day-to-day work life. So if you do some back of the envelope math, the VA score on this is 42%. So we're talking about 200,000 people who say that this specific survey has made improvements in how they, or has led to improvements in how they are able to provide their service to veterans. Everything from getting pharmacy medications turned around quicker from prescription to administration, lots of employee wellness activities, lots of governance to do with nursing, groups. So the places that groups go once they start talking about how they feel about their work and what can be done better are usually really impactful, and that's why we try to push the data down as low in the organization as we can. Best places to work is an overall job satisfaction measure. So each of these tiles have a color that corresponds to the valence of that score. And they also have a click event that shows a drill down in a few different ways. And this is one of the things we try to do that's consistent across the different data displays we have. There's a quick takeaway that you can get just at a glance, and then there's more that you can get one level down, sometimes two, if you really want to. So it's great for a briefing because you can kind of read the room and see where people want to spend their time. So in this case, we have scores for the facility, its region, the entire healthcare sector of VA, and then up to VA overall, just for some context, for this year and for last year. So everything we show has some comparison data, and everything we show also has the change score since last year. Peers shows how the site stacks up against other sites in its region. So these are other VA facilities in the same region as Boston. So people often want to know what rank they are, how they stack up. This gets those questions out of the way early on so they can focus on the within facility data that's usually more impactful. Direct reports is one level down in the org chart. And I should say too, all these tables and graphs are sorted by default. So there's a useful sort based on the scale. So you don't have to kind of orient yourself to where the high scores are, or the low scores. They filter automatically. And that's a small thing, but when you have so much data, the usability gain you get from that is really important. The colors correspond to statistical testing of groups. So green is better than a comparison group or improved since last year. Red, of course, is the reverse. And here we can look back to 2018 to get the trajectory. So each of these has that same ability. I'll spare you the details with going through each one, but that's the UI piece here. Each of these also has a breakout that corresponds to the org chart. So response rates chosen by default, but I'll select best places to work. So every organization, as I mentioned, is mapped all the way down to the very small team level, 5, 10, 15 people. So this is a very intuitive display for people, especially for executives, because it matches the schema of the organization that they already have. The color, of course, corresponds to the value of the score. There's a scale up here with VA for reference. Again, these numbers, just to reiterate, these numbers are fictitious, but representative of the kind of variance that you see. So they stop at 2 levels down by default, just because hospitals are big places. But if you want to see everything, then you can uncheck that quick map toggle. And now there's a lot, because again, it's a big organization, but you can get a quick visual triage of the entire organization. So you can imagine, as a director, as a service chief, you can really start to see just quickly where some of the hotspots and bright spots are within your organization. The additional layer of detail here is accessed by clicking on the dot. So if I wanted to click on, I'm just picking a group at random here, I can see a drill down into their specific data, and also a scrambled supervisor email here as mapped locally. Easy to follow up with people this way. I did see a question. I'm trying to watch the chat, but there are lots of questions. I saw a question about the URL of the site. This is internal to VA, so nobody outside VA could access it. So that's why there's no URL available.
I can help ask some of the questions too, Ryan.
Yeah, please.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I was just popping in there. I didn't want to interrupt the flow, though. One of the questions that people asked on Slido was, I'm new to R and RStudio, and my employer would like their data source refreshed daily used in their scripts. Is Shiny the recommended method?
So we don't do a lot of that, honestly, because we have sort of large single efforts versus kind of continuous incoming data. I've seen really effective use cases for that. I think it depends a lot on the way the data are stored and to the extent that you can access it through some sort of API or database.
Thank you. Another question that came up earlier was, is there any concern from IT regarding the use of R and Shiny
Yep.
as the government traditionally uses SAS? Or is this true?
So there is concern, there is inertia to overcome. That's been a process. You need, at least in my experience, you need executive sponsorship to be able to say why the ultimate outcome matters, because a lot of IT departments aren't going to care about the details of this. They care about security, they care about maintainability. So if you can get somebody at a level that has sway with other IT leaders to make them care and see the value, then you can get more movement that way. At least in VA, there's a really detailed process to go through to get approved to be an app and to be on, in our case, Azure. There's a federal Azure space that we're on. So we have to go through all that review, which is slow, but you do get there eventually.
As a follow-up to that, I love Hugh's comment in the chat. Hugh said, "This is amazing. I work for VHA, and this app is so much better than how we used to get AES results. You might need to help me on the acronyms here. But what has been your experience with R and VA?"
Thank you for the feedback. It's been good, especially for local work. So using it on your desktop is not an issue. It takes an admin to install RStudio, but that's typically not a problem. To get on Azure and get connect and get stood up that way is, I mentioned a pretty long process. It took a couple of years. There's a lot of contracting and IT and related functions that have to be on the same page. But I think it's doable. We certainly did it. It just did take a long time.
Can I ask you a follow-up to that? If somebody is listening now and starting that process off, what is something that you wish you knew about then or something that was really helpful to you through that process?
Something that is helpful that I wish I'd done earlier is do what I suggest that people do and have an executive sponsor at a high level that comes in to clear some of the obstacles. It's like any bureaucracy. I think there are a lot more people who can say no than can say yes. So you need to find that person who can really motivate people to work on this project on your behalf.
Thank you. I'll save some of the other questions for a little bit later. So I'll let you
Sure.
get back to the talk. Thank you.
I did see one that's easy to take. Limitations on VHA's Azure Space CRAN only or GitHub. Haven't run into any limitations yet. We try to stay with CRAN just for reliability reasons, but no issues there.
Great. Thank you.
Sure. So next we talk about employee engagement and burnout, and we do that in the same way and with the same kind of interface for both of those constructs, just again for kind of predictability reasons. So we talk about engagement in terms of the percent of the organization that's engaged versus mixed or kind of on the fence, maybe engaged sometimes, but not always, versus disengaged. So the percents are easy to see here as a bar graph, and then there's always a change score toggle that's a plus minus. The VA's dots are for reference again, so if you're the director of Boston or whatever facility, you can easily see where you fall against VA itself. And then for every bar graph, you can, the one layer down here is you can click on the bar and the little cursor kind of turns into a hand to kind of cue you into that. You can click on the bar and see a drill down onto in a few different ways on that specific construct. So for disengagement here, for example, we see it by supervisory level, from most disengaged to least. By service, a lot of variance here. Again, fake data, the little banner at the top gives that away, but you do see, 40, 50, sometimes more points of variance at the service level. Work group, again, those small teams of 5, 10, 15 people. And you see the most variance here because people who are in the same occupation don't all have the same supervisor. And so that's why there's usually more variance at the work group level. There's a supervisor effect, basically. And then info will just have background on that specific construct. So this is nice because we've got, maybe 15, 20 people doing these briefings. And some people are more or less familiar with some of the details of the measures. So it's a great reference for us, but also for our executive audience, because we leave this app up all year and there's a lot of traffic throughout the year. People come back to it. And so you can easily remind yourself what the details of that measure are. For engagement and for burnout, we also have hotspot and bright spot maps. So these are like those maps you saw a minute ago, but now we pull specific groups out that have either a concerning score in the case of a hotspot or a good score in the case of a bright spot. So these are groups where disengagement is at least 50%. So you get that quick kind of triage and again, capitalizing on the schema of the org chart that people are already familiar with. Same thing for bright spots, engagement of 75%. So in this case, for example, it's useful to see the org chart display because if you're the chief of social work, you can see you've got 3 groups that that meet this threshold. If it was the reverse and you had 3 groups that met the disengagement threshold, there'd be some sort of cluster effect likely. So you'd want to know about that. So burnout is next, and it's the same kind of display for predictability reasons. Here we talk about the percent of the organization that has 0, 1, 2, or 3 out of 3 symptoms of burnout at least once a week. So the more symptoms you have, of course, the more burned out you feel. So the bar graphs show the scores, the dots for reference for VA overall, the drill downs by clicking on the bar. We have free text themes here as well. So in the survey that this data comes from, people can also leave free text comments, and we theme those and report them out verbatim as well. We bring in the themes here just as a kind of an idea of what's top of mind for people when they're prompted to say something about their workplace. As you can probably imagine in healthcare, especially now, burnout is top of mind for a lot of folks. So you see that quantitatively and also qualitatively in the comments. Hotspot and bright spot maps again. And then we have 2 questions, a lot of bright spots here in this fake set. We have 2 comments about COVID, or 2 questions about COVID rather. Extra professional stress because of COVID and extra personal stress because of COVID. And the scale is from none to extreme, so you can see the distribution there. And then I'll spare you the detail again, but you can click on the bar and see the same drill downs as you've seen so far. Any questions before I jump to the next section?
Yes, there are a few other questions coming in from YouTube and LinkedIn. One was, can you touch upon performance giving multiple users using the app simultaneously?
Mm-hmm. So we have it's a 16-core, 64 gig server, and we can handle about 100 people at the same time. That's across a few applications though, and some are more RAM heavy than this is, although this is still pretty heavy. There are huge data sets that go into this, and we try to cut them down and do as much pre-work as we can, but there's no way around some of it. So we do okay with 100 at that size server. You can play with the settings and connect how eager versus unwilling it is to spin up a new session for incoming users. So you can have more people piled onto the same process, or you can have more processes. It's some experimentation. There's also Shiny Cannon. I think that's the search term you want to use to do some testing. But that's at least our experience.
Thank you. Another question that was over on Slido that I see has been upvoted a few times was the UI all done with bslib, or did you also incorporate JavaScript and CSS?
It's the base is bslib, and there's a lot of custom CSS. Yeah. Not so much JavaScript. I think the only script I can think of offhand is what toggles it to be full screen to remove the browser noise at the top. So not a lot of JavaScript, but a lot of CSS. Yeah.
Thank you. And this question, I think, was shared in a few different places. But it was, can you either share code with us or give general guidance on where to learn the click on, like, drill down interface function?
Yeah. So the maps, well, I'll start at the top. The maps are from, let me go back up here. These maps are using collapsible tree. It's like, that's the package name. So there's a Shiny binding that gives you the input, so you can use that to generate a modal that has the information for the thing that was clicked on. So that's how to do it here. For bar graphs, these are all done with Plotly, and there's a binding for Shiny. There's a click binding that you can use to reference the, for example, the row number of the data set that corresponds to the bar that was clicked on. So it's a little finicky to set up, but once you get it, it's pretty reliable. That's how we do it.
Great. Thank you. I was trying to find the links very quickly and share them in the chat as well, but I can also share those with the recording. I see somebody had asked if the session will be available later. And yes, right after the session, the recording goes up at the same YouTube live link. Okay, one other question. I see that Giannis asked, how could I integrate an R Markdown file which could export more than one interactive plot at once in a Shiny application?
I don't know. Haven't done it. Best of luck, though.
We could try and find some other resources too, or if anybody has ideas, feel free to share them in the chat. And then one other question. Eugene asked to clarify, how do you serve the dashboard? Is it on RStudio Connect or
It's
a Docker?
Yeah, we have a Connect instance that's on Azure, and so we just get a link for this page and send it out to everybody. Yeah. I see Matthew had a question too about it's anonymous, but it can be attributed to the manager. Yeah, so the intent of this, and this takes a lot of work and sort of institutional familiarity to actually make it stick, but we've been doing this for 15 years or so now, so we've got some of that. The purpose of this is purely developmental. The only thing that's in performance plans has to do with using the data, not about getting a specific score or anything like that. So yeah, by mapping it on the org chart, there is, like, you can see who supervises what group, but virtually no one uses it for that purpose, because the data wouldn't be useful then if we did that. Like, as soon as you create a standard that's going to be mandated, or you create a bar that has to be cleared, then people find ways to clear it, even if that may not be how they actually feel.
Thanks, Ryan.
Good question. So the next section is a different kind of display, just a table format here for DE&I data. The cool thing here, though, is the comparisons we do, not really the display itself. So we've got 4 DE&I questions, and those are linked above, but we use those, and also 3 overall experience indicators: best places to work, engagement, and burnout. And for every demographic, we test the minority against the majority. and then shade where the minority is lower than the majority. So if you see a lot of red, basically, it means that in this hypothetical organization, people who you see have red cells are reporting more discrepant experiences on the topics you see the red cells for than the majority categories for their demographic. So for disability status, for example, people who said they do have a disability, 21% discrimination versus 11% for people who say they don't have a disability. And there are 2 pages because we have so many demographics that would make too big of a table to show it at once. But as you can imagine, this is very interesting for executives to see. And there's also change scores, again, available here. And for those, the comparison is every group to itself last year rather than to its majority. And if they improve, then they get green or whatever you've changed the good color to be. If they went down, they get red. The next piece of, there's 3 main pieces of DE&I here. The next piece is about intersectionality because, of course, one demographic doesn't describe anybody very well. So here you can pick patterns of demographics and see how people feel about those same measures, but who meet multiple demographic conditions. Sorted so that it's high to low discrimination, and of course, that's the coloring is a basic heat map scheme. And finally, we have hotspots again here for those 4 questions. So for each of those questions, we can pull, again, those groups out of the org chart and see where some concerning scores may be. We don't do bright spots here because there's no way to know whether a group is being very equitable and inclusive and so on, or whether it may just not be a diverse group in the first place. So bright spots wouldn't really work well here, but hotspots do. Second to last data piece we have here, priorities and turnover intent. So priorities show what people in the group say they most want to work on over the next year. So we can see that prioritization, same click events as before. Same thing for turnover intent, which, as you can imagine, if you're an executive, you want to know who's thinking of leaving and where you may have some staffing shortages. And then what's pushing people away. So the reasons people who said they want to leave gave for wanting to leave in the first place. The last data piece here has to do with just culture. So if you're not familiar with that term, the idea is just that people need to feel, especially in safety critical applications like healthcare, need to feel like they can speak up and say when something's not right, but also that there are standards and they're transparent and equitable and so on. So you want to be up here in this top right area, and you don't want to be in this off diagonal. So this is a Plotly scatter plot. The background colors, of course, just kind of cue you into where the desirable range of scores for these issues are. And you can change the questions to get different views. You can search and see, for example, all nursing groups at once if you wanted to. And then you can also toggle between work groups, which is the default, and between occupations. Because again, those are similar but specific. And finally, there's a table below that has these these same scores. But you can also, if you wanted to see the lowest groups all at once, you can drag a lasso and the table updates to only show those groups. And then you can download this table easily to Excel. The tables are using the DT package. So you get the sortability and the downloading and so forth kind of by default, or at least very easily through that interface. Executives usually want to recognize groups that do well, so it's easy to get additional resources we make available here, or to see a table that's sorted automatically by default, just to make it easy to do that. And then finally, we have just a bunch of extra resources that people have gotten used to seeing in VA. extra reports. The data store is another app that's on Connect that we made that makes it really easy to pull specific data in data set form versus in report form. Other dashboards and tools and videos and so on. The bookmark button is great if you're using Connect because, or I think Shiny Apps does it also. This will give you a custom URL that remembers all of your input selections. So if you're the director of Boston, let's say, and you've gotten to this point and you've set up the page the way you want, you can hit bookmark and then save a URL that will preload all those same selections for you next time. So it's easy to come back and kind of pick up where you left off. Hotspot and Brightspot downloads just give you Excel files of those groups. And then this is just a basic Bootstrap accordion. So that's the app. Happy to talk about it more or any piece of it more. But that's what I had to show you.
Thank you so much, Ryan. This is amazing. I see a lot of people commenting in the chat that are impressed with your plots and the app in general as well. Let me jump over to Slido and see some of the other anonymous questions too. One question was, what did you use to create the tables in the app? Was it DT?
DT.
Yeah. DT? Okay.
Yeah, DT.
Awesome. Another was, how long did it take to get this app up and running?
We had a previous version of it, so it's hard to say because a lot of the back end was in various stages of completion. I'd say, a month maybe. It's been a while and it's hard, you don't track the hours, as you go. I'd say a month probably of solid work to get it where it is now.
Yep. Awesome. Another was, if this is an annual survey, how much time or months are dedicated to the various steps of analysis, then UI design and reporting?
Yeah, so the survey this year went out in June. It was open for most of June. We do most of it. We don't collect the data ourselves for a variety of reasons. There's a vendor who collects the data for us. We get the data from them early July, and we started briefings August 29th. So there's a lot of analysis that goes on, data cleaning and building additional reports that I haven't shown you and building this. And so it's maybe 45 or so business days of development time. And then throughout the rest of the year, the team that I'm on and me will spend, maybe 10, 15% of our time on improving it for next year, filling in some of the gaps or taking out some of the hacks we had to do at the last minute.
That's great. I see somebody else just asked, I can't copy it over quick enough, but they asked, what did the process of designing the UI look like? It's so clean, but there's so much information in there. Do you have specific expertise weigh in?
Trial and error. We have a few executives we partner with and kind of bounce ideas off of. It doesn't mean we build it exactly to their specs because you do have your own theories of presentation and what's effective and what's not, but there is that feedback. The overall aesthetic is based on Microsoft's Fluent design language. So if you Google like Microsoft Fluent, it'll show you their style guide. So it's easy to, well, not easy, but it's possible to use CSS to replicate some of that. And this matches roughly sort of the Microsoft corporate-y vibe that some of our other enterprise level applications have. So to an executive who isn't, checking, all these apps all the time, it looks familiar and seems credible. So that's the point of the aesthetic we have here.
That's awesome. A question that I had was, how has the use of the app in these executive briefing sessions changed the conversation, or maybe changed some of the work that the team's doing?
Mm-hmm. I think it drives a lot of the work the team does, and it certainly changes it from what it used to be. So you could imagine the alternative to this would be a 200 slide PDF or PowerPoint. And at that level of detail, you're really only taking away the site scores overall. You can't focus on where the hotspots and bright spots are, for example, because there's just so much. So it becomes an issue of support, in specific areas for specific topics, rather than just sort of letting the data kind of wash over you and having a vague impression of how people feel. That's the main difference. From the bottom up side, I mentioned a few, but the things people are able to do as a result of these conversations are really remarkable. Backlog reductions in claims, better patient handoffs between different care teams and facilities. Others are more lighthearted. There's just so many things people do.
I see Jim asked I realize, a similar question too. And it was, what is the return on investment for the VA?
It's a lot. It's hard to quantify, as you can imagine. Like you can't put a dollar amount easily on something like, smoother patient handoffs or better communication on your team. Some of the things we quantified had to do with claims reduction backlogs of 5-10%, which are at the scale that we have is a lot. Savings from duplicative processes across different teams that maybe didn't know about it before, but they start talking and see that they've both got this ready. So yeah, there's not one number, but if there was, I think it would be quite high.
Great, thank you. I see one other question that just came through on Slido was, do you put this Shiny app behind any sort of user authentication like Okta?
No, but that sort of happens for us because we're on the federal cloud. So to get to it, you have to be on VA's network, basically. You have to be in our Active Directory. But beyond that, no, it's open to anybody in VA.
Great, thank you. One other question I had is, if somebody's watching this right now and hoping to be able to create an app like this and is just getting started, what would you recommend for them in learning Shiny?
That's a good question. I would say take it slow, be incremental. If you pick, pick your own sophisticated application that you may have seen. If you try to do that right away, it's probably not going to work and be frustrating. So for me, I try to get everything on the screen and then do the UI. So sort of like how Markdown breaks down the content versus the markup. I just want to get the data on the screen, and then I come back and make a formatting pass, and you revise and iterate. So persistence is kind of a boring answer, but that's my answer. And figuring out how to Google things well is a big part of it too.
Yeah, what did this app look like in its first stages?
Not good. A lot of the data was there. It was a lot slower. So I mentioned speed as something that's important. Taking another run through the back end and focusing on speed was really important. If you have a lot of data, I haven't found anything faster than data.table. I think there may be a tidyverse wrapper package for that, but if you need things to happen fast, then our data.table is the way to go. Yeah, so how did it look before? It was more of a default bootstrappy type look, and it didn't fit well on different screen sizes, wasn't mobile friendly, so this will reorient itself if you're on a mobile device, to at least display usably well. So it was much more rudimentary before.
Did you just hit that point where you're like frustrated with the 200-page PowerPoint, or how did you make the switch over?
It was frustration personally and sort of in aggregate across our office, because we could just tell that, you sort of know that you're not getting people exactly what they need at that level of detail, with that huge of a presentation. But getting to something that could actually scale for us is really important, because we have 50 people versus 420,000. So We do reports in Flex Dashboard for every site. So figuring out how to do that opened up some doors. We do single page PDFs for every work group. So 30,000 PDFs. Just figuring out how to do it at scale was really the barrier for us. We knew for a while we could do better, but just needed that toolbox to be in place for us.
I want to make sure I didn't miss anybody's questions. So if I did from earlier, please feel free to just copy and paste it again into YouTube or LinkedIn or Slido. I think I've seen everything over on Slido, but just want to double check. Ryan, for other government or public sector employees who are trying to make the case for open source technologies or being able to use R and Python, I know you said finding an executive sponsor was really helpful, but is there other advice that you have too?
Yeah, and this gets to someone else's question about ROI as well. If you can get contractors to price you out what this looks like for them to do, then the ROI becomes quite clear. We've had estimates for 100,000 plus for every site. So when you have a few hundred sites, you're talking dozens of millions of dollars. So compared to, I think we have a 350 person license connect contract. So the ROI there, just in terms of replacement cost, is quite high. If you can show that, then that's one option. If it's being done, then they're probably paying more for it than it would cost to make in-house. I would say make sure you go through your organization's IT process from the beginning, even though it's going to be painful, and you're going to want to lean on that executive to get you around certain barriers. Make sure you're still checking all the boxes, because when it comes time to maintain your system, or if the maintenance contractor changes, there are all sorts of things that can happen, and then you fall through the cracks. Or maybe your sponsor moves on, and then you have to get funding again. So do it slowly but the right way, I think, versus trying to reach for that kind of skip to the front of the line method, even though it's attractive.
Thank you. I see one question it just disappeared. One question I think I missed earlier was someone asked, have you looked at Arrow or Parquet instead of data.table?
I know the term Arrow. I haven't done any more looking into it than that, because data table's been fast enough for us. But I know there are newer alternatives. Yeah. I think they're in some of the data table benchmarks that I saw last.
Cool. One other follow-up question on that example you said of like going through the IT process very early. How did you kind of build relationships with the IT team? And is it like centrally managed by IT now?
Sort of. So there's a more central decision-making body that in sort of a more distributed implementation body is sort of the rough lay of the land. You start to, at least get name recognition with folks, and then depending on where your organization is positioned, you may have additional overlap with some IT functions. Like we have a few other things we do that put us on IT's radar. So they knew a little bit about us, and it wasn't like we're a complete stranger coming into them. And to be fair to them also, at least for us, I know other agencies, look different, but the scale of VA IT, like us coming with this, is sort of like asking a shipyard to build a kayak. It's sort of in the ballpark of the thing they do, but it's just such a different scale, and it's not related directly to patient care. It's not a benefits processing system, so it's a little bit outside their immediate concern. So being understanding of their reality too, I think, is important. Showing some empathy and just being persistent really is the best advice I can give.
Great, thank you. One last question I have for you before we go. I know Hugh had commented in here, who works for the VA as well. I was curious, do you have some sort of like data science community or like user group internally?
I think there are a couple. We have a Teams channel of our users. It's fairly decentralized as far as I can tell. There are different offices that have their own teams that focus on their own functions. So there's not, at least not that I'm connected to, there's not a large centralized data science in VA organization.
Mm-hmm. Let me double check once more, see if there are any other questions. Thank you for letting us throw all these questions at you
Oh, for
as
sure.
well. I don't see any others, but really appreciate you sharing the app with us. It's amazing and so cool to see the impact that it's had in the organization as well. If people do want to get in touch with you at some point after, is LinkedIn the best way to stay in touch?
Yeah, LinkedIn's okay. I'm not active and I don't check it very often, but I guess I'll get the notification if someone messages me. So that's fine. The first page of my slides, if you have that, my email is linked behind my name. It's just ryan.derickson@va.gov. So feel free to reach out there too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ryan. Really
Of
appreciate
course.
it.
Thank you all.
Have a great rest of the day, everybody. I'll see you next week.